Chapter 7. The old heart and the young heart in the presence of each other. At that epoch, Father Gillenormand was well past his 91st birthday. He still lived with Mademoiselle Gillenormand in the Rue des Filles du Calvaire, No. 6, in the old house which he owned. He was, as the reader will remember, one of those antique old men who await death perfectly erect, whom age bears down without bending, and whom even sorrow cannot curve. Still, his daughter had been saying for some time, "My father is sinking." He no longer boxed the maid's ears. He no longer thumped the landing place so vigorously with his cane when Basque was slow in opening the door. The Revolution of July had exasperated him for the space of barely 6 months. He had viewed, almost tranquilly, that coupling of words, in the Moniteur. M. Humblot Conté, peer of France. The fact is, that the old man was deeply dejected. He did not bend, he did not yield. This was no more a characteristic of his physical than of his moral nature, but he felt himself giving way internally. For 4 years he had been waiting for Marius, with his foot firmly planted, that is the exact word, in the conviction that that good-for-nothing young scamp would ring at his door some day or other. Now he had reached the point, where, at certain gloomy hours, he said to himself, that if Marius made him wait much longer, it was not death that was insupportable to him. It was the idea that perhaps he should never see Marius again. The idea of never seeing Marius again had never entered his brain until that day. Now the thought began to recur to him, and it chilled him. Absence, as is always the case in genuine and natural sentiments, had only served to augment the grandfather's love for the ungrateful child, who had gone off like a flash. It is during December nights, when the cold stands at 10 degrees, that one thinks oftenest of the sun. M. Gillenormand was, or thought himself, above all things, incapable of taking a single step, he, the grandfather, towards his grandson. "I would die rather," he said to himself. He did not consider himself as the least to blame. But he thought of Marius only with profound tenderness, and the mute despair of an elderly, kindly old man who is about to vanish in the dark. He began to lose his teeth, which added to his sadness. M. Gillenormand, without however acknowledging it to himself, for it would have rendered him furious and ashamed, had never loved a mistress as he loved Marius. He had placed in his chamber, opposite the head of his bed, so that it should be the first thing on which his eyes fell on waking, an old portrait of his other daughter, who was dead, Madame Pontmercy, a portrait which had been taken when she was 18. He gazed incessantly at that portrait. One day, he happened to say, as he gazed upon it, "I think the likeness is strong." "To my sister?" inquired Mademoiselle Gillenormand. "Yes, certainly," the old man added. "And to him also." Once as he sat with his knees pressed together, and his eyes almost closed, in a despondent attitude, his daughter ventured to say to him, "Father, are you as angry with him as ever?" She paused, not daring to proceed further. "With whom?" he demanded. "With that poor Marius." He raised his aged head, laid his withered and emaciated fist on the table, and exclaimed in his most irritated and vibrating tone, "Poor Marius, do you say? That gentleman is a knave, a wretched scoundrel, a vain little ingrate, a heartless, soulless, haughty, and wicked man." And he turned away so that his daughter might not see the tear that stood in his eye. 3 days later he broke a silence which had lasted 4 hours, to say to his daughter point blank, "I had the honor to ask Mademoiselle Gillenormand never to mention him to me." Aunt Gillenormand renounced every effort, and pronounced this acute diagnosis: "My father never cared very much for my sister after her folly. It is clear that he detests Marius." After her folly meant, after she had married the colonel. However, As the reader has been able to conjecture, Mademoiselle Gillenormand had failed in her attempt to substitute her favorite, the officer of lances, for Marius. The substitute, Theodule, had not been a success. Gillenormand had not accepted the quid pro quo. A vacancy in the heart does not accommodate itself to a stopgap. Theodule, on his side, though he scented the inheritance, was disgusted at the task of pleasing. The goodman bored the lancer. And the lancer shocked the goodman. Lieutenant Theodule was gay, no doubt, but a chatterbox, frivolous, but vulgar. A high liver, but a frequenter of bad company. He had mistresses, it is true, and he had a great deal to say about them, it is true also. But he talked badly. All his good qualities had a defect. Gillenormand was worn out with hearing him tell about the love affairs that he had in the vicinity of the barracks in the Rue de Babylone. And then, Lieutenant Gillenormand sometimes came in his uniform, with the tricolored cockade. This rendered him downright intolerable. Finally, Father Gillenormand had said to his daughter, "I've had enough of that Theodule. I haven't much taste for warriors in time of peace. Receive him if you choose. I don't know, but I prefer slashes to fellows that drag their swords. The clash of blades in battle is less dismal, after all, than the clank of the scabbard on the pavement. And then, throwing out your chest like a bully and lacing yourself like a girl, with stays under your cuirass, is doubly ridiculous. When one is a veritable man, one holds equally aloof from swagger and from affected airs. He is neither a blusterer nor a finicky-hearted man. Keep your Theodule for yourself." It was in vain that his daughter said to him, "But he is your grandnephew." Nevertheless, it turned out that Gillenormand, who was a grandfather to the very fingertips, was not in the least a granduncle. In fact, as he had good sense, and as he had compared the two, Theodule had only served to make him regret Marius all the more. One evening, it was the 24th of June, which did not prevent Father Gillenormand having a rousing fire on the hearth, he had dismissed his daughter, who was sewing in a neighboring apartment. He was alone in his chamber, amid its pastoral scenes, with his feet propped on the andirons, half enveloped in his huge screen of coromandel lacquer, with its 9 leaves, with his elbow resting on a table where burned 2 candles under a green shade, engulfed in his tapestry armchair, and in his hand a book which he was not reading. He was dressed, according to his wont, like an incroyable, and resembled an antique portrait by Gareth. This would have made people run after him in the street, had not his daughter covered him up, whenever he went out, in a vast bishop's wadded cloak, which concealed his attire. At home, he never wore a dressing gown, except when he rose and retired. "It gives one a look of age," said he. Father Gillenormand was thinking of Marius lovingly and bitterly. And, as usual, bitterness predominated. His tenderness once soured always ended by boiling and turning to indignation. He had reached the point where a man tries to make up his mind and to accept that which rends his heart. He was explaining to himself that there was no longer any reason why Marius should return, that if he intended to return, he should have done it long ago, that he must renounce the idea. He was trying to accustom himself to the thought that all was over, and that he should die without having beheld that gentleman again. But his whole nature revolted. His aged paternity would not consent to this. "Well," said he, this was his doleful refrain, "he will not return." His bald head had fallen upon his breast, and he fixed a melancholy and irritated gaze upon the ashes on his hearth. In the very midst of his reverie, his old servant Basque entered, and inquired, "Can monsieur receive Marius?" The old man sat up erect, pallid, and like a corpse which rises under the influence of a galvanic shock. All his blood had retreated to his heart. He stammered, Marius what?" "I don't know," replied Basque. intimidated and put out of countenance by his master's air. I have not seen him. Nicolette came in and said to me, "There's a young man here. Say that it is Marius." Father Gillenormand stammered in a low voice, "Show him in." And he remained in the same attitude, with shaking head, and his eyes fixed on the door. It opened once more. A young man entered. It was Marius. Marius halted at the door, as though waiting to be bidden to enter. His almost squalid attire was not perceptible in the obscurity caused by the shade. Nothing could be seen but his calm, grave, but strangely sad face. It was several minutes before Father Gillenormand, dulled with amazement and joy, could see anything except a brightness as when one is in the presence of an apparition. He was on the point of swooning. He saw Marius through a dazzling light. It certainly was he. It certainly was Marius. At last, after the lapse of 4 years, he grasped him entire, so to speak, in a single glance. He found him noble, handsome, distinguished, well-grown, a complete man, with a suitable mien and a charming air. He felt a desire to open his arms, to call him, to fling himself forward. His heart melted with rapture, affectionate words swelled and overflowed his breast. At length all his tenderness came to the light and reached his lips, and, by a contrast which constituted the very foundation of his nature, what came forth was harshness. He said abruptly, "What have you come here for?" Marius replied with embarrassment, "Monsieur." Gillenormand would have liked to have Marius throw himself into his arms. He was displeased with Marius and with himself. He was conscious that he was brusque, and that Marius was cold. It caused the goodman unendurable and irritating anxiety to feel so tender and forlorn within, and only to be able to be hard outside. Bitterness returned. He interrupted Marius in a peevish tone. "Then why did you come?" That then signified, "If you do not come to embrace me." Marius looked at his grandfather, whose pallor gave him a face of marble. "Monsieur, have you come to beg my pardon? Do you acknowledge your faults?" He thought he was putting Marius on the right road, and that the child would yield. Marius shivered. It was the denial of his father that was required of him. He dropped his eyes and replied, "No, sir." "Then," exclaimed the old man impetuously, with a grief that was poignant and full of wrath, "what do you want of me?" Marius clasped his hands, advanced a step, and said in a feeble and trembling voice, "Sir, have pity on me." These words touched Gillenormand. Uttered a little sooner, they would have rendered him tender, but they came too late. The grandfather rose. He supported himself with both hands on his cane. His lips were white, his brow wavered, but his lofty form towered above Marius as he bowed. "Pity on you, sir. It is youth demanding pity of the old man of 91. You are entering into life, I am leaving it. You go to the play, to balls, to the café, to the billiard-hall. You have wit, you please the women, you are a handsome fellow. As for me, I spit on my brands in the heart of summer. You are rich with the only riches that are really such, I possess all the poverty of age. Infirmity, isolation. You have your 32 teeth, a good digestion, bright eyes, strength, appetite, health, gayety, a forest of black hair. I have no longer even white hair, I have lost my teeth, I am losing my legs, I am losing my memory. There are 3 names of streets that I confound incessantly, the Rue Charlot, the Rue du Chaume, and the Rue Saint-Claude. That is what I have come to. You have before you the whole future, full of sunshine, and I am beginning to lose my sight, so far am I advancing into the night. You are in love, that is a matter of course, I am beloved by no one in all the world. And you ask pity of me? Parbleu. Molière forgot that. If that is the way you jest at the courthouse, messieurs the lawyers, I sincerely compliment you. You are droll. And the octogenarian went on in a grave and angry voice. Come. Now, what do you want of me? Sir, said Marius, I know that my presence is displeasing to you, but I have come merely to ask one thing of you, and then I shall go away immediately. You are a fool, said the old man. Who said that you were to go away? This was the translation of the tender words which lay at the bottom of his heart. Ask my pardon. Throw yourself on my neck. M. Gillenormand felt that Marius would leave him in a few moments, that his harsh reception had repelled the lad, that his hardness was driving him away. He said all this to himself, and it augmented his grief. And as his grief was straightway converted into wrath, it increased his harshness. He would have liked to have Marius understand, and Marius did not understand, which made the goodman furious. He began again. What? You deserted me, your grandfather, you left my house to go no one knows whither, you